So picking up our exercise, do you think like an economist? We are now up to statement number 5. Statement number 5 and statement number 6 deal with one of the most famous economic terms you're going to hear. Even if you've never taken an economics class, you've probably heard this expression: supply and demand. Supply and demand are economic tools that were used to analyze markets. So we're going to use number 5 and number 6 to analyze some of the introductory ideas associated with markets. Before we do that, we'll let you in on a little bit of a secret. This do you think like an economist exercise and the 10 statements we're going to analyze, they all end up being false. Number 1 was false. Number 1 and 2 actually were false based on the idea of scarcity. Number 3 and 4 were false based on the idea of opportunity cost. Number 5 and 6 are also going to be false, along with 7, 8, 9, and 10. But even though you know the outcome already, it's still important to go along with the economic rationale behind each statement. So, number 5, if mass transportation fares are raised, almost everyone will take trains anyway. The key to understanding this particular statement is the term fares. The cost of getting onto a train or a bus, some other type of mass transportation. If you take a bus to work every day and it costs $1 to take the bus, and the price of the ride goes from $1 to $1.50, it's a 50% increase, but you might not even blink at that increase in price if the bus still gets you there on time and the experience is quite pleasant of riding the bus. However, economists think of markets in terms of more just the price you pay to get on the bus or the train. The cost of riding the train could be raised in many other ways. Some simple ideas are perhaps the trains are not exactly clean, maybe they're run down, maybe they're just overcrowded. Not enough offerings, too many people on one train or one bus. That can make the experience unpleasant. If the mass transportation does not get you to work on time because it's perpetually late, the cost of riding the train could be quite substantial. Your boss is not going to accept you coming to late every day because mass transportation or public transportation can't get you to work on time, especially if you're already taking the earliest offering that public transportation has. So there's 2 ways that the cost of riding the train can be increased. The worst case scenario would be if something god awful like a terrorist attack happened. If there was a bomb in the New York City subway system or some other mass transportation system and people felt as if it was unsafe to ride trains, you could make the price free to get on and off the train, and no one would take the transportation because they were fearful for their lives. Continuing on with our exercise of do you think like economists and picking it up with statement number 6. Again, 5 and 6 deal with markets and supply and demand. This next statement is one of the most interesting statements to evaluate. The more useful a good, the higher its price. This actually drove Adam Smith, the father of modern economics and capitalism, a bit crazy. He believed in principle that this statement should be true, that if a good or service was more useful to society, it should demand a higher price in markets. However, the price of a good or service is not determined by the usefulness of a product or service. It is determined by the market forces of buyers and sellers, of demand and supply. Matter of fact, Adam Smith coined a phrase called the diamonds to water paradox. Diamonds to water meaning comparing the value of diamonds and the price of diamonds with the value of water and the price of water. So for instance, or I should say for example, assume you are stranded on a deserted island and you're going to be there for the foreseeable future, much like Tom Hanks in Castaway. You might be there for quite some time. You have your choice. Every morning you can get delivered 1 gallon of free drinking water, or a quarter carat diamond. Now, I know it might break some people's hearts, but the diamond is basically useless to you on a deserted island. The clean drinking water, that is life-sustaining liquid. So, obviously, to human beings, water is far more useful. However, diamonds, they definitely garner a much higher price in a market. So this idea of diamonds to water paradox. The paradox is that even though diamonds are basically worthless in practical terms, they're quite valuable or pricey in terms of markets. More about supply and demand in chapter 3 of our study of economics. Number 6 and number 7 deal with an economic principle called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is something that is the basic economic tool or principle which drives international trade. Statement number 7 says, if someone makes an economic gain, someone else loses. One of the most important ideas associated with economics is that you do not have to be made better off at the expense of someone else. In other words, I do not have to push someone down in order for me to climb up further. Let's look at a specific example that drives home this point that it is false that if someone makes an economic gain, someone else loses. Why is this false? This exercise of Lucy, the lawyer, should help clarify the idea that if someone makes an economic gain, someone else loses, is totally a false statement. So here we have Lucy. She's a defense attorney. She litigates in the city of Philadelphia. She's one of the most gifted lawyers in the entire city of Philadelphia. If you get convicted of a crime and you need a good defense attorney, she's the person you want in your court defending you. Lucy typically works 8 hours a day. Now, Lucy has two choices. She can dedicate her entire day to litigation services, which we already said she's an amazing lawyer. But there's also administrative duties which need to be completed based on being a lawyer. Behind the scenes, some research, some data gathering, some paperwork, some type of administrative assistant services that you typically hire a secretary or that type of administrative assistant to complete. But in addition to being an amazing lawyer, Lucy's also the most efficient administrative assistant in all of the Philadelphia area. What it would take a normal person like you or I 8 hours to complete, she can finish all of these duties in 1 hour. So, if she does not hire an administrative assistant, she works 7 hours as a litigator. She charges $2,000 per hour for her litigation services, and she collects $14,000 a day in revenue. But if she has to do the administrative services herself, that's 1 hour a day she cannot dedicate to litigation, charging customers for her lawyer services. What if Lucy decides to hire a person to do the administrative assistant tasks necessary to be completed for her lawyer services? Okay, if Lucy decides to concentrate her 8-hour day into performing the task in which she has a comparative advantage, the litigation services, she can now work all 8 hours litigating at $2,000 per hour. She now collects $16,000 in revenue. She hires Adam to work as the administrative assistant. She pays Adam $50 per hour. He's not quite as efficient as Lucy with those administrative assistant duties. It only took her 1 hour to get the job done, but it takes him 8. So in 8 hours, she pays Adam $400 to get the work done. Now, are they both made better off? Well, sure. Lucy now collects $16,000 in revenue per day, right? She makes an economic gain of $1,600. Why? The extra hour she spends litigating is $2,000 in additional revenue, minus the $400 she has to pay Adam. So she makes an economic gain each day of $1,600. And Adam, he's quite happy. he's making an economic gain every day of $400. So this simple example proves the idea that it is absolutely positively false to say if one person makes an economic gain, someone else loses. Returning to our do you think like an economist exercise, and building on what we just learned from statement number 7, if someone makes an economic gain, someone else loses, we just demonstrated that that statement was false with the microeconomic example of Lucy and Adam. Now let's evaluate statement number 8. Statement number 8 says, if one nation produces everything better than another nation, there's no economic reason for those two nations to trade. The same basic economic ideas or principles which make statement number 7 false also make number 8 false. 7 is a microeconomic example of the principle of comparative advantage, and statement number 8 is a macroeconomic example of the very same economic principle. This class will evaluate international trade and the economic rationale behind international trade at a later date, but statement number 8 is basically making the same false assumption as statement number 7, and that's the reason why the statement is false. We will go into much more detail about how and why comparative advantage makes international trade possible and the economic rationale and sense of comparative cost at a later date. But suffice to say for now that statement number 8 is also false because it has the same vital flaw as statement number 7. Statement numbers 9 and 10 deal with some basic economic ideas about business, and they're more related to microeconomics than they are macroeconomics, but still important for us to evaluate even if you're studying macroeconomics. Number 9, a non-regulated monopoly charges the highest possible price. Let's first introduce a few definitions. Monopoly. Yes, it is that fun board game we all like to play, but in addition to being the board game, to an economist, monopoly means a situation in which one firm, one company, or one corporation, they represent an entire industry. They control an entire industry. They produce a product or provide a service in which there's a very high demand for that product or service, and there are very few, if any, substitutes available for purchasers or consumers or buyers in the market to turn to a different company. If you think back into the 1800s, Carnegie had the monopoly on steel, Rockefeller had the monopoly on oil. If you wanted to buy those products, you bought from those companies. So a non-regulated monopoly is a situation in which the government has not stepped in with any form of regulation. If you have taken microeconomics, you may have remembered such regulation as the Sherman Act or the Clayton Antitrust Act. But sometimes governments do not regulate monopolies, and then monopolies are free to charge whatever price they wish or desire for that good or service. Microsoft had a virtual monopoly on operating systems for a long period of time across the globe. Microsoft still has a dominant position in operating systems in computers. In the 90s, 95% or better of computers on planet Earth ran the Microsoft operating system. In 1995, Microsoft introduced a new operating system called Windows 95. Because Microsoft was a non-regulated monopoly, they were free to charge whatever price they chose for this new operating system. The company decided to charge just under $100 for the new operating system. Why did they choose such a low price? Microsoft realized that their end goal was not to make as much money as possible per operating system, but as much money possible in total. Therefore, Microsoft realized that they would collect far more in total revenue by charging a lower price per operating system and enticing many millions more people to buy it. So a non-regulated monopoly does not charge the highest price possible, or the highest possible price. Even a non-regulated monopoly must adhere to what we call the law of demand. Now, what is a regulated monopoly? Those are companies we're familiar with, such as your local utility companies, your natural gas company, or your electric company, in which the government has decided that one company is allowed to produce this product or provide this service, and the price they charge will be regulated by a regulatory government board. Statement number 10. Most businesses don't care about consumers, they just want higher profits. This should be obviously false to all of us. In the short run, a business might get away with trying to maximize profits without caring much about their customers. But Adam Smith envisioned this idea of what he called consumer sovereignty, in which capitalism worked because competition forced businesses to adopt the least cost method of production, so produce goods and services in the most cost-effective method, which is quite efficient for society, but also that money would be spent by consumers on goods and services they most desired, and they would only spend money when they felt as if they had a good customer experience. I think Adam Smith, if he were alive today, would seriously appreciate things like the Amazon feedback that you can review on each one of your purchases every time you use Amazon. Or something like Yelp, where if you go to a restaurant, you can read reviews. The internet has seriously altered the power landscape when you talk about who has the power in the economic relationship between businesses and consumers. Online reviews make it quite easy for consumers to quickly and efficiently evaluate how well businesses treat customers. And if businesses don't treat customers well, they perish.